You know this feeling, you're sitting there having family dinner very innocently with your 5 uncles and 3 wives, and the local fireman is also there, as well as 2 policemen. 2 of your uncles also get arrested, which is completely unrelated to that evening. But what does happen that evening is, boom, you have a huge political discussion. And niece Sandra starts crying because she thinks that Shell and Exxon are ruining the world. Now, I don't want to talk about your uncle's family disputes, whatever, today. I'll leave it up to you. But what I would like to delve into is the Exxon and the Shell part of the story. Because whenever you read Western media, or you happen to go to a party and you talk to people and you don't know what to talk about, so you bring up oil and energy because you want to impress the girls, but it does not really work and they run away crying. Quite often it seems that Shell, Exxon, Chevron, that those companies come up again and again as being the principal perpetrators of climate change. Now, what I want to do today is give a little bit of nuance of how big of a contributor those companies actually may be to climate change, and why a lot of the pressure on them or focus may actually not lead to the desired results when it comes to limiting global warming. So there are 3 components to today's video. Number 1, Shell actually does not produce that much oil. What would you think? Shell. For how much of global oil production does the company account? 5%? 10? 20? 69? Shell itself accounts for roughly 1.3% as of 2023. Now, if we also put the other companies into the mix that often are mentioned time and time again, such as an Exxon, Chevron, BP, or TotalEnergies, we're talking about a total of roughly 7 to 8%. Now, whoa, hold up there, Philip here from the future, from about 2 hours later. I realized I was just throwing numbers around without actually explaining them in much detail. So for context, those numbers are arrived at by looking at the company's annual reports, 2023, links in the description if I don't get hit by Alzheimer's or a truck. And then that's just divided by the total global oil production number, which you get from the Energy Institute, which I also link down below. Side note here, by the way, I rounded oil production up to 100 million barrels per day, but it's a bit of a conflation of concepts because technically real oil production was only 96. So there may be a 0.1 or 2 percentage difference by calculation. Bottom line still being we're talking about 7 to 8%. And second asterisk, in 2024, Exxon and Chevron actually acquired 2 new companies, Pioneers and Hess respectively, so that also pushed up their share technically. We're still talking about roughly anywhere between 7 and 10%. Bear in mind, this is oil production, so this is how much crude oil you get out of the ground. We also could look at this from the perspective of refining capacity, because you need to take the crude oil and you need to process it into a refinery where it is turned into products that you would actually use for, well, things such as driving your Lambo to work, crashing your Lambo into the wall because you hate your work, and then reassembling your Lambo because you kind of still need to pay the bills, even though you got a Lambo. Life is weird. But for each of those things, you need diesel or gasoline, not quite sure, rather a Lambo runs on one or the other, and certain petrochemicals for the assembly of the vehicle. This brings me to the second point. Pressuring a Shell and an Exxon to reduce their oil production will not lead to less oil production globally, per se. We've seen that over the past 15 years or so, where BP, Shell, and Total have reduced their oil production. Other companies have increased it. Global oil production went up quite significantly. If you look at the list of the 10 largest oil companies globally, by production, 8 out of them are so-called national oil companies, meaning they're principally tied to a government, to a national government. The government is either the major stakeholder or the only stakeholder, and gives direction to the company. Now, This stands in contrast to how a Shell or an Exxon function, which are publicly listed, which have a lot of different shareholders, which can actually pressure them into moving into a certain direction. Quick intermezzo number 2. So to the left here you see the 10 largest oil companies, as explained earlier, and then to the right you see their respective largest shareholders. So Saudi Aramco, Saudi Arabia, Rosneft, Russia, KPC, Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, Kuwait, etc., etc. So all of those in blue means they're principally government owned. Does not mean the government is the only shareholder, but either largely or totally. So what this then means is that if you're going to pressure Shell and the BP into decarbonizing, moving away from oil, and they move away from oil, that so far this has been largely picked up by other oil companies, principally national oil companies. And then the question in the mid to long term becomes, well, if you're shifting oil production away from public shareholders to governments, will it become easier or more difficult to pressure them into decarbonizing? This is not a bridge to the last point, but I do need to get to the last point. So let's go to the last point. Third point is that while the oil industry is an extremely large emitter, people may still overestimate how large it actually is. So to put it into perspective, firstly, for the oil industry, we're talking about roughly 30% of global emissions. And there are two ways of measuring emissions. We have, on the one hand, CO2 emissions, and we have greenhouse gas emissions. Now, for CO2 emissions in 2023, we're talking about a total of roughly 38 billion tons. If we look at greenhouse gas emissions, which also includes methane and fluorides and some other stuff, we're talking about roughly 53 billion tons. Online, you can find a carbon watch where you can see how much budget we have left before breaching the 1.5 degrees, which as of February 2025 is about 185 billion tons. So doing some complex mathematical equations and deductions, you can see that it's roughly 3 to 5 years. So this is just to give a basic overview of where we're standing in terms of emissions. Let's circle this back to the company discussion. So the numbers you're seeing here, those are calculated from the reported numbers from the companies themselves. Again, links in description and in an Excel that I'll leave there. And if you tally them up for those 5, we're standing at a total share of global emissions of about 6-ish%. Now, bear in mind, this includes the gas operations and the gas sales, so the share of oil would be slightly lower, but those are the numbers that are reported by the companies themselves. Now, oil is more emission intensive than gas, even though in terms of overall production, for most of those companies, it's relatively evenly distributed between oil and gas. But bottom line being here, it's safe to say that if we're talking about oil operations only, it's probably around 4 to 5%, which is slightly higher than the share you would expect if you just go with the calculation of, well, we have 1/3 of global emissions that come from oil, and you have 10% of oil production that comes from those 5 companies, so that's 3%. Either way, we're talking about roughly a range of 5-ish%, right? I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you think that's a lot or not. Now, my dear friends, to wrap it all up very quickly, because I know you don't have the time nor the attention span for this shit, neither do I. 3 points. So, firstly, at the main point, that I'd argue Shell, Exxon, etc., that a lot of people overestimate how much oil they actually produce. Second point, I'd argue that if you pressure them into producing less oil production will just be shifted to national oil companies, which in the long run are actually more difficult to pressure to decarbonize or produce less oil. Third point is more of a nuance, really, explaining where emissions actually come from. I'll delve more into detail another time. It's roughly 1/3 for oil, which is a lot on the one hand, but on the other hand, if you look at only the 5 companies, we're talking about roughly 4-5-ish% of global emissions that they contribute via oil. My name is Philip. I'm your host from Commodities Corner. This is all for today. and more follow soon. Have a good night or day or whatever you're up to.